Well, it's really good to be back with you after 6 whole weeks. The first weekend that I was away, I spoke at the Common Dreams conference in Brisbane, and that's been followed by 5 wonderful weeks travelling in Europe with Claire. The first time I've ever been to places like Paris and Marseille, Barcelona, Venice and Rome. It was an amazing time, not just the places we visited, but the luxury of all that time together just to be. We got back on Wednesday night, knowing that on Friday I was due to travel to Newcastle to speak at not 1 but 3 sessions of the Inspiracy gathering that was planned by some Newcastle Uniting churches, by 3 different churches. When I said yes to the Inspiracy invitation some months ago, I told myself I'd have it already prepared before I went to Common Dreams in Europe, because there would only be 1 day in between and I might be jet-lagged. But the weeks before I went away were unexpectedly hectic. I don't know why they were unexpectedly hectic, but they were. So preparation happened on Thursday, and unfortunately I had the worst jet lag I've ever experienced. Not that I felt tired at the wrong times, I just didn't want to sleep at all, or couldn't sleep at all, which was really okay because I had a lot of work to do and I needed the prep time. The other thing that I didn't get done before I left was the sermon for today, though I had done the liturgy that we're using this morning. And so I was planning to write the sermon very early this morning after I got back from Newcastle last night. But yesterday, when I was talking to Paul and May Cotterill, who were at Inspiracy, Paul suggested that instead of writing a sermon, I share my Friday night talk with you. This was a blessing, and so that's what I'm going to do. I said yes to speaking at Inspiracy, despite the timing, because of the opportunity to meet the Filipino artist Emmanuel Garibay and to see his work. You might remember that on the Sunday after Easter, I showed images of Garibay's amazing Emmaus meal paintings, in which he represents the risen Christ as a Filipino woman in a bar surrounded by companions who are roaring with laughter when they recognise the Christ in their midst, not as an elite Anglo male, but as a working woman of colour. I was inspired by the way that Jenny Burns and Rod Pattenden were bringing together spirituality with justice and with art, and by the way the programme valued beauty in the struggle for justice, by the blending of inspiration and conspiracy, by the naming of spirit in a way that is embodied and active, an understanding of that spirit is something in which we all participate and yet greater than any one of us. By the understanding of the human person as earth creature, one with the planet, which undergirded so much of what was on offer over the weekend. Doing the work of justice has been a passion in my life, and Inspiracy made the important point that it took me years to understand, that art and beauty are not luxuries, but essential to sustaining a life committed to justice and peace. So on Friday night, I told a story about an event, a time in my life that inspired me to join the conspiracy of justice and love. But I began with talking about something quite down to earth, about toilets. While Claire and I were tourists in France, which is where our trip began, in late September, it was still quite hot, and so keeping hydrated was an issue, and subsequently so was finding public toilets. Now, I have an odd fascination with French toilets, because as a teenager, I had decided that I wanted to spend my last year of high school as an exchange student, and initially I really wanted to go to France. But my mother was adamant that I would not be going to France because, quote, they have strange toilets. So while Claire and I were travelling, particularly in Provence, we stopped in small villages, and I did see some of the old squat over a hole in the ground kind of toilets that so concerned her. At that point I thought she had a point, and we usually ended up paying €2 to buy another espresso and the use of the cafe toilet. But the toilet is not the point of the story, because my parents agreed, quite naively in retrospect, that I could instead go to Cape Town, South Africa. The toilets were unremarkable, but it was 1976, the year that the revolution to end apartheid took flight with the Soweto uprising. It took me another 40 years to get to France, but that year in South Africa changed my life. I lived during the year with 3 ordinary white families, attending a whites-only high school. The families had black servants, maids and gardeners, who lived in and only returned to their own families in the black townships for one night a week. I was critical of the system that kept them apart from their own children, and appalled by the segregation of public spaces into white and non-white. The toilets may have been physically ordinary, but the discrimination and segregation into white and non-white was morally dangerous to the spirit of black and white, coloured and Indian peoples. But as I had been instructed by Rotary, I mostly kept my views to myself, carefully testing the waters before embarking on any conversation about the morality of apartheid. I did read what I could, especially the Cape Times, which provided a counter source of information to the sanitised normality of everyday apartheid, including, as the Cape Times did, reporting the numerous deaths of black people in custody and the farcical explanations for their deaths provided by the state. I remember standing on a beach outside of Cape Town with my host sister Alison, and Alison pointed out Robben Island, where she told me that Nelson Mandela and other violent revolutionaries were imprisoned. By then, Mandela had been in prison for 12 years. He would spend another 6 on Robben Island and 8 more on the mainland before his release in 1990. That he would one day be free, let alone President of South Africa, was unimaginable on that bright sunny day on Bloberg Strand. Midway through the year, things began to come apart. School children, first in the Transvaal and then in the Cape, began to march in the streets protesting apartheid, protesting the inadequacy of their education, particularly that they were forced to study in Afrikaans, which Desmond Tutu, who was then Dean of Johannesburg, called the language of the oppressors. Their peaceful protests were met with tear gas and guns. Yet the protests continued for months. Hundreds of people died. For the first time, coloured and Indian people joined together with black people to resist apartheid. Though the struggle took years, change became inevitable because of the events of June 1976. On the day that the first protest happened in Cape Town, a month later, I had done something previously unimaginable in my good girl life. I skipped school, and I took the train to the centre of Cape Town to explore. I especially wanted to see District 6, the historic coloured inner-city neighbourhood that had been rezoned as white, but where coloured people continued to resist relocation to the desolate Cape Flats. I was in the city when hundreds of young people descended. I remember how youthful they were, my age or younger. I remember how passionately they chanted as they were met with army tanks, soldiers in camouflage, firing tear gas and rubber bullets. All around me, shopkeepers were locking their doors. My white privilege protected me, and I was let into a clothing boutique, safe inside, watching the violence and the chaos from a distance until it passed out of sight. After the protest had ended, I made my way back to the train station. The air was still thick with tear gas, and my eyes were streaming, and I was finding it hard to breathe. A middle-aged black man passed me, and seeing my distress, called out, "It is your government that has done this to you, madam." He used the deferential word madam to a white girl, and yet he was also defiantly saying that it was not his government. I replied, "It's not my government." I later wished I had answered with more compassion. What the apartheid regime was doing to his people was beyond my imagination until that day. For the first time, I saw the resistance and solidarity that is necessary to act against injustice, to act against evil. Police repression of black students in Cape Town's townships of Langa, Nyanga and Guguletu led to further protests, and coloured students joined with black students in solidarity. At night in our white suburb of Pinelands, we could hear gunfire in Guguletu. My white friends were concerned about their own safety, but we were oblivious to the fact that during 1976, a total of 128 black and coloured people, mostly young people, were killed and over 400 injured in Cape Town's racist violence. At that stage in my life, I was a somewhat evangelical Christian teenager, and I participated in a number of churches during that year, eschewing the deadly boring Presbyterians, which was my tradition, for the more lively Baptist and Pentecostal churches that my host families and friends attended. The vast majority of the people attending those churches believed that apartheid was in the interests of black people and that it was God's will. When they prayed, it was for their own safety. But I also met Christians who were committed to denouncing and ending apartheid. One of them was Frank Nelson, who is now Anglican Dean of Adelaide. On an exchange student trip in combi vans to Kruger National Park, on which Frank was a chaperone, I first learned about Christian opposition to the injustice of apartheid. Not an accidental conjoining of people who were Christian and opposed to apartheid, but Christians who actively opposed it because of their faith. These church leaders were able to criticise the government more freely than the leaders of the black groups. In the following decade, they were pivotal in altering public opinion about apartheid policies. Spending year 12 in apartheid South Africa taught me that religion could either be a source of oppression or a force for transformation. Since then, I have tried in small ways to work on justice issues around race and gender and disability and sexuality, challenging the streams of my faith tradition that are life-denying, and drawing from the wells of spirit and liberation that are, ironically, also part of our tradition. It's been 40 years since I spent that life-changing year in South Africa. If I had only my anger at injustice to sustain me, I would have burned out long ago. As an ethicist, I am grateful for the resources of faith that nourish theological reflection, spiritual refreshment, and celebration along the way. Visual, literary, and musical arts, spiritual practice, and theology all sustain my commitment to justice. I remember the time when I discovered the idea of Christa, first in feminist theology and then in the art of Emmanuel Garibay, scandalizing those who would freeze the maleness of Jesus of history and those who would constrain the wild, liberating power of the transforming Spirit, which is born now by the whole people of God. I concluded my Friday night talk by talking about the Saturday sessions. The first involved theological reflection on the power of the risen Christa for women and men to free the Christ from individualized, gendered limitations which restrict the idea of God with us to one particular expression in the historical person of Jesus of Nazareth. Using art, including Emmanuel's Emmaus paintings and Nicholas Slee's Christa poetry, I explored the claim that while Jesus died as a Palestinian Jewish man, Christ rises to be God with us in many different forms, including Christa community. In the Saturday afternoon session, I told some stories of liberation struggles that I had been involved in since that year in South Africa, and invited the gathering to explore the ethical and spiritual implications of reimagining Christ as the whole faith community engaged in the work of love and justice. If Christ, Christa community, is risen with us and in us, how does this inspire our lives as people of faith? Saint Teresa of Avila claimed in words we still speak today, Christ, Christa, has no body now on earth but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which Christ, Christa, looks compassion on this world. In concluding the Friday talk, I asked, how then shall we live in just relation with all who are excluded from being understood as bearing the image of God, people, creatures, and planet? Where will we find bread for the journey, and how will we celebrate glimpses of God's reign? As Zacchaeus' story illustrates, in the midst of an oppressing and oppressive society, God's justice comes when people are willing to change their perceptions and their actions. The church, as a community of justice-seeking friends, encourages me and calls me to account. The work of poets, painters, musicians moves me to claim that there is so much more to life than what has been sold in the shopping malls. On Thursday, I questioned why on earth I'd said yes to speaking at Inspiracy. By yesterday, I was so glad I did, because it enabled me to reconnect with my passion for justice and for the church as the community, loving the world God loves. To return from holiday, delighted by all that we had seen and done, but also delighted to be back here at Pitt Street, resuming our journey together as we listen to one another's stories and sustain one another in the journey of life and justice. Inspiracy reminded me that we are called to embody Christa community and to remember that poetry, music, and art that we share in liturgy each Sunday are not frivolous luxuries, but bread for the journey of love, life, and liberation. May it be so. Amen.